Have you ever been in an environment where everybody doesn't like you, everybody has something negative to say about you, and everything that you do is viewed in a negative light? Well, that's the experience of the person I'm going to talk about today. Welcome to Becoming the Influential Me, the podcast with me, Michelle Chikanda. I'm so glad that you've joined me. Super grateful for your time. So let's dive right in. This week is the cap of the series of the women who failed to let their failures define them. And I thought, who better than Melania Trump? Why? Because it's Christmas and people will forgive me if I say something controversial, because 2021 is a new year, right? And also I thought it's really interesting because 2020 has been capped with a lot of hostility. You know, there's been racial tensions, there's been political tensions, there's been tension everywhere you look. One thing that I am all about is understanding journeys, and I thought the people I respect most in this world have been people that have a conciliatory view to life. I think without getting political, you know, I don't have to agree with the right or the left in order for me to learn from both sides. So oftentimes I talk about people that have political views and ideological views that are aligned with my own or that are more socially acceptable. But this time I thought, can I learn something from somebody who's a little bit more marginalized, obviously just a little bit, and whose views that don't necessarily, you know, directly correlate with my own. And so I decided to do it. And that person is Melania Trump, the current First Lady of the United States. I am a political fiend. I love politics. It's what I studied, but I never worked in it because of the nature of the beast, shall we say. So let's dive into the failures that, you know, Melania Trump experienced that she didn't let define her. There are plenty, but I thought I would drill into the key points about where she failed in theory and how she failed to let that define her. And good for her. So the first one is that RNC speech. Oh my gosh. It was before she'd even started, right? That moment where she plagiarized Michelle Obama's speech at the Republican National Convention, and it was the same speech that Michelle Obama had made 8 years previously at the Democrat National Convention. I don't even know what it called, but anyway, and that as a human being must have been just humiliating. You know, your first moment on the world stage, as it were, because people do watch these things from across the world, and you copy somebody else. Interesting, right? Okay, next failure. I don't care, do you? That famous jacket. Why? That was also an interesting moment. It was the moment where people started to say, well, is Melania really a victim, or is she, you know, a perpetrator? Is she as cruel, for example, as her husband is? You know, questions really began to ring through about who this person is. I'm going to talk about why that's Melania's superpower shortly. But for now, let's keep going down the list of those pesky failures. The batting hand. So the first failure, the speech, says she's unintelligent. The second speech says she's unethical and unkind. The third failure says she's a bad wife, and that's the hand thing, right? The whole, every time they hold hands, they're, you know, batting off each other. Like, what's going on there? Do they really love each other? Is it all for show? Is she just in it for the money, or what's going on? It really makes people question whether these two people are in a loving marriage. Okay, so, you know, the fact that she keeps swatting away his hand, she wore white to, you know, Donald Trump's first State of the Union address, and that was meant to signify that she was anti-him, right? She was in solidarity with all the women, and all these things. And then there was the designers. So, you know, traditionally, every First Lady tries to wear American designers because it's supposed to be promoting Americanness, and also, you know, just being, patriotic. So when she didn't do that and started wearing all these, you know, glamorous European gowns, she was, of course, unpatriotic, un-American. So those are some of the examples of how she has failed. You know, to some people's minds, she's failed far more than that. And I'm sure there's lots more we can dig into, but I'm going to stop there to give you an illustration of how she was unintelligent, unethical, unwifely, and un-American, which is pretty much failure on every single level. So the question is, how did she fail to let that define her? Melania Trump's superpower is that you cannot define her. I honest to God think she is the only person who knows who she is. And she likes it that way. Now, the first one of the things I said was, in your career, when you walk into a room or into an organization, or maybe you've been there for a long time, and people don't like you, they have negative things to say about you, it's not going well, anything that you do is viewed negatively. This is the environment or the world that Melania Trump has lived in for the last 4 years, and potentially even more. And one of her superpowers, and the way that she's failed to let that define her, is nobody has been able to define her. Is she a victim? Is she a villain? Is she, is she a good person? Is she a bad person? Is she intelligent? Is she not intelligent? People have spent hours, days, months, years trying to figure out this woman. And to this day, nobody can really claim to be an authority on who she is and why she does what she does. Now, one of the things that allowed me to get through those moments where I was in an environment, I remember I was working for this company, and before I showed up, people had been looking at my LinkedIn profile to see who I am and had decided that I was too young, too unqualified, too unintelligent, too this, too that. And so I came into the job, and a handful of people spoke to me. In the entire organization, people would blank me. If I asked a question, they would answer only what I'd asked them. It was a very hostile environment for me to be in. And I was upset by it, but I realized that in order for me to make progress in this organization, I couldn't let the conditions or the environment change who I am as a person. So what did I do? I was cheerful. I, was trying to do things to the highest standard as far as I knew how. I still spoke to people. I offered people cups of tea. I refused to let the environment change me. And eventually, my environment changed to suit me. And this is, I think, where Melania is going with this. She hasn't let her environment change her. She committed to very few things, but mainly that she would be a mother first. And by and large, she has stuck to that. So let me ask you a question. Are you in control of your narrative? As in, are you in control of the story around you? Or are you responding? Because one thing I refused to do was to respond when people were being unfriendly is probably the right word. Nasty is going too far, but just making it a hostile enough environment to make it a difficult place to work. And instead of responding, which is being stroppy and whatever, I chose to get them to come up to my level. That sounds really awful and big-headed, but ultimately sometimes that's what you have to do. If people act like children, then you have to show them how grown-ups do it. Okay, so that is interesting. So the way that Melania has failed to let her failures define her is by being undefinable as a person to the media and to other portions of society as well. And good for her, because it has meant she has stayed true to who she is. One of the things that I talked about in the last few podcasts, or one of the strands, as it were, that we've learned from these women, from Ariana Huffington, from Maria Sharapova, from Helena Morrissey, and from, the Q&A and things like that, is this need to have that internal peace, if you like, and that internal place where you can go, because only then do you really truly discover, I guess, who you are meant to be. And Melania seems to have this in droves. This woman gets who she is, and she has nothing to prove. And as a result of that, I guess she can just get on with it and leave, create jobs for everybody else. Now, I want to play a little clip for you, which I found fascinating when I heard this, because as Melania is such a private person, the only real glimpse that we've had to her true personality has been through, Stephanie Wolkoff's expose, her book that she wrote. And in it, I wanted to share the clip that she shared about Melania talking about how people were over-analyzing everything that she did. And, she basically created work for people and her attitude to that. So just have a listen really quick.
Yesterday I wore that pink dress from Pro and the Soldier. Okay?
I love that dress.
Okay. Now they're saying, oh, wait a moment. I guess she was wearing that dress because she didn't say anything about gay parade on Sunday. She wore it Monday to give the nod because they're gay couple, right?
Yeah.
For a story.
I didn't see it.
That's how I saw it.
I didn't.
And they wrote the story. I did, and you said like, you know, and they you read it, and it's like, what? Excuse me? It's like, wow, these people are really like crazy and obsessed.
Fascinating, isn't it? What I loved about that clip, or what I found interesting about it, is actually what inspired me to do this podcast. Because I see this woman who is bodyguard-esque, you know, with her sunglasses and her stern face standing next to her husband. And yet, when someone like Brigitte Macron describes her, this is how she describes it. I've got to read it. She says, Melania is kind, charming, intelligent, and very open. She laughs very easily at everything. But she shows it much less than I do. Because everything is interpreted and over-interpreted. And I thought that in particular was very interesting, because I thought there's this woman that we see that's very guarded, very speaks very, very little, and when she does speak, it's, you know, scripted and to the point, and that's it. And then we hear about this person who laughs very easily and is caring and is kind. And again, this is what inspired me to do this podcast, because I thought she's a human being. She feels all the things that we feel. You know, she feels the rejection and the sadness, and, you know, she has feelings. Which is a scary concept, right? We like to demonize those people that, again, whose ideas and political inclinations don't align with our own, but we can certainly learn from them. So let's continue to do that. Okay. Why else do I think Melania succeeded in failing to let her failures define her? She didn't go out of her way to convince people that, you know, I'm a good person. She knows she's a good person. So every time something happened, if there was a scandal, she would just ask, you know, her press secretary to just put something out. And it was usually 2 or 3 lines saying, you know, this is her view. She's focused on what she's focused on. Anything else is just noise. And I thought to myself, most other people, if you or I were in that position, we'd be building teams about communications and trying to, you know, do events that were painted in a positive light. And again, I just think it is credit to her that she has decided she just wants to live her life in the way that she wants to. And if we as women had the courage to just do that, to have convictions in who we are and what we're capable of and how we see the world would be a much better place. I genuinely believe that. I think for a lot of times we are afraid to be who we truly are. Melania Trump could have started doing, you know, talk shows, and not that she'd be invited, but there'd certainly be more clips of it, even from the right-wing media, right? But, you know, she could have started doing talk shows and trying to get friendly with the left-wing media, but she didn't do that. Why? Because her commitment was A, to being a great mother, and B, to being true to herself, and that is her as a private person. Now, when you show up at work, and this is what I find really interesting, because I'm going to talk a little bit about motherhood. Melania always said that, you know, being a mother was her first priority, and she's lived up to that. And when you show up at work, what's your first priority? Because I've seen it where people say my first priority is my child, or my first priority is getting a promotion, but everything they do at work is the exact opposite. And then what happens is frustration takes hold. Because your values are, you know, directly in direct contradiction to how you're showing up at work. And even though we might say the first lady shouldn't be prioritizing, you know, her child, she should be prioritizing the country. Firstly, it's not my country. So I have different views on that. But secondly, says who? Right? She is a human being, and as human beings, we have the right to live out our lives how we best see fit. And so if she is doing that, kudos to her. But how are you doing that? How are you showing up in the workplace? Is the way you're showing up aligned with your values? Is the way you're showing up highlighting what is most important to you? Are you even in the right role? I mean, as we come to the end of the year, this is definitely the time to think about that. Is your narrative, and are your values aligned with the work that you're currently doing? Does it give you a great sense of joy? Is it aligned with who you are as a human being? Michelle, are you saying I should leave my job? Well, no, I'm not saying you should leave your job. But what I am saying is it's important that you do work that is aligned with who you are as a person. Because when you do it that way, you're more likely to show up in your best light as the best version of you. We are past the point in our evolution as human beings, hopefully, touch wood, where we simply work for a paycheck. Maybe it's because I'm a millennial, but purpose matters, fit matters, aspiration matters. How you brand matters, both the company's and your own. And one thing that I'm taking it back to Melania Trump, one thing that I do admire her for is staying true to her core and finding ways to make her professional fit her personal, not the other way around. Just a thought. Again, a little bit out there, but there it is. Okay, so I've talked about the mum first agenda. What else would I like to talk about? The journey, Melania's becoming. A lot of times we like to think of Melania, or I do, let me not project, as arm candy, right? Donald Trump's arm candy. Unintelligent, just really beautiful. She stands by his side, and sometimes she lives up to that. In truth, she stands there like a bodyguard and just sort of smiles with her sunglasses on. Sometimes, if you're lucky, if you get a smile, right? So sometimes she does live up to that. But with that said, this woman has been on a journey. Imagine growing up in communist Europe and deciding that you want to be a model at a very young age, young by my standards. Scary. And deciding to go for it. She went to Paris, she went to Milan, and she eventually ended up in the United States. Now, that is not for the faint-hearted. I know people that will not even apply for a job in the next city, let alone in a different country. Now, when we look at that and what she was able to achieve, and in terms of, even aside from Donald Trump, her being on a billboard and all of this stuff, she managed to make a living, and she managed to make a good living, in a completely different country, in a different continent, and it was all in pursuit of her own ambitions and her dreams. How are you going after your dreams? Are you pushing the boat out enough? Or maybe you're telling yourself, America's too far. Not to say that, America, metaphorically speaking here, but are you saying, the ultimate dreams that you have, are you putting them aside and saying, what, that's too far from me? Well, then take this lesson from Melania Trump. Just saying. Okay. And then one thing that I love, and I keep banging on about this, is how she managed to outfox the media. That is quite a feat. This woman should run training. She should run media training because she's gone up against the greatest beast in our lifetime, bar social media, but that also has its own, But to go up against that and not be fearful and not let people, in your view, get away with what they shouldn't get away with, and not let people define you, and not let people talk about things that, that are completely irrelevant and you react. She didn't. She has stood her ground and she's clear on who she is. And she again goes to that inner quiet place and lives her life. Now, I think that is a lesson. I think the greatest lesson, because again, I feel like if I was in that position, or if we were in this position, we would probably be calling the best crisis management brand perception team on the planet to try and salvage some kind of positive brand. But you don't have to. You don't have to bend to the will of the masses. When I think of successful people, they're often the people that go against the grain. When I think of, I think actually one of the things that Arnold Schwarzenegger, obviously I'm naming all the greats, because, my repertoire only extends to LA and New York. But when we think about, what he was able to achieve in terms of his career, he went from somebody who was a bodybuilder, and then he went into acting, and from acting he went into politics. And one of the things that he says is when you hear no, when somebody says no, hear yes. And he says, you know what, instead of saying, I'm going to go to that restaurant at the time when everybody goes at dinner, or, at lunchtime, go when it's empty, at 11 o'clock or at 10 o'clock. And so this is what he says. He says sometimes the the most walked on path is not the best one for us. So what path are you walking on? Is it the one that everybody else is on? And how can you move and make sure you live out who you really are and who you really want to be, whether or not that path has been walked on before by somebody that you know or don't know? I just think it's a very interesting time in our lives where we can reconsider how we're doing life. And it doesn't mean you have to change it in one way or the other. Maybe you're happy exactly how you're doing it, at the pace you're doing it at, and that's also okay. But my thing is, A, are you doing your best? And B, are you being true to yourself? I like that I dropped in the be best there. Did you see what I did? Yeah, okay. So let's talk about the fact that she didn't let the fact that she's un-American by wearing European designers faze her. This woman is European. Yeah, she's an American citizen, but she's European. And she has continued to wear European designers, and that's okay. Again, what's the lesson here? The lesson here is, if it's true to who you are, and she likes stylish things, and unfortunately, American designers are not better than European designers. Sorry, guys. And so she's being true to who she is by wearing things and clothes that she likes. And I see absolutely nothing wrong with that. The final thing, and I think this was at first it was a little spark. Shall I do Melania Trump? And then what turned it into a flame and, got me sitting here talking about her was the whole thing with Stephanie Wolkoff-Winston, who was Melania's friend, and she did this story, Melania and Me, and I thought if that was my friend, I'd have been furious. And then there's things that happened before that. Melania stabbed her in the back. It's literally like school, this whole thing. But here's what I like about how this whole situation has played out. Let's bring it back down to earth for a moment. Have you ever had a friend or a feud or with a colleague at work, with your manager, and they just do something and you're enraged by it because it's disloyal, it's unkind, it's this and it's that? What do? Do you take the higher ground, or do you try and, get them back? What I like about how the story between these two women played out is I was listening to Stephanie Wolkoff-Winston on a podcast, and I've seen her a couple of times on the news, and I thought it's really interesting that every time she shows up in the news, she looks like she is about to cry. The rage and the anger is still visible. She doesn't come across as somebody who is, credible, intelligent, and in control of her own narrative, which is exactly what she's trying to regain by telling everybody this stuff. And Melania Trump, the person that she hates, largely got away with it unscathed. She put out the typical Melania style, 2-sentence statement, done with it. Right? And I think sometimes as women, when we try and avenge the people that have done wrong things to us, or we try and get even or do these things, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And Melania, in this case, in my view, has come out on top. And she's done so by saying very little. So sometimes when you feel aggrieved and you want to take it to your manager and you want to let him have it, just think twice. Or you want to let her have it, or you want to, get your point across and really let it be known. Sometimes it can end up not working in your favor, especially if you're emotionally connected to that situation. I know that this is relevant for a lot of people. For some people, it's the end of the year, which means you're having your appraisal conversations, and maybe you've been given a lower mark than you would have liked. And the question is, how do you respond to that? Do you respond to that in an emotionally charged way? And I don't mean yelling by any means, but I mean in terms of your thinking process. Are you thinking about it in a vengeful way, or are you thinking about it as, actually, how can I use this so that it works in my favor? How do I use this as a stepping stone? How can I use this to facilitate better conversations with my stakeholders? How do I use this to get more from my working life? Maybe it's time for me to move on, whatever it is. But rather than having a vengeful mindset, actually thinking, I've got to take control of my own narrative. I've got to issue my 2-sentence statement and start building things that actually allow me to create and cultivate the life that I want to live. And I think that this is an interesting lesson from Melania in terms of this dynamic, which potentially could have been earth-shattering, right? Because the media's waiting. They're just waiting for her to put a foot wrong. And this story has largely gone down quite flat for Melania and has potentially damaged Stephanie's reputation. I don't know, it's just worth considering. When we're faced with conflict, when we're faced with challenging situations, how do we rise from those situations? And I don't mean rise in temper, but actually rise in terms of allow it to cause us to think about things in a different way. This week I've been looking at the future of work. How will we be working in 1 year? Interesting. But more interesting than that is how will we be working in 10 years' time? Now, when you rise to the little things and allow your emotions to consume you, what you're doing is you're taking time away from the things that you could be thinking, the gains that you could be making. The world is about to step into a very interesting direction, and it literally will never be the same again. But how are we navigating that? Are you even thinking about 10 years' time? And if so, are you writing those things down, and are you taking action steps in order to get them? I think a lot of the time society distracts us, right? Our working life distracts us, our family distracts us from thinking about the ways that we can shape the future. I've been thinking about not how I'm going to be, a participant or, a follower, but how can I shape how this world is going to move forward. And if I fail at that, at the very least, I'll be a very active participant. So my question to you is, how will the world have changed in 10 years' time? And what's your narrative going to be through that transition? How can you shape that future for yourself and for others? So Melania Trump has been fascinating, and I hope that you have enjoyed that as much as I have. And I hope that more than anything else, we can continue to learn from people that are, not the usual and are not necessarily aligned with all our beliefs. And I'm not saying we should take it to the extreme by any stretch, but it is so important that we do not become polarized, because actually the most influential people are those that can look at the right and the left and extract the lessons from both. So I hope that this little short session about Melania Trump has inspired you to, take control of your narrative and to, craft your own message and do things that are true to who you are, to find strength sometimes in not bending to the will of others, and most importantly, to chart your own path, go for your dreams, go get those stretch goals and go for them, because now you have the best excuse. The world is changing, so I'm changing too. And that is it. I'm a little bit sad because this marks the end of the Women Who Fail to Let Their Failures Define Them series, and I've really enjoyed discovering all these incredible women and the journeys that they've charted, and also also using those people's stories as a lens through which I can view my own. I'm really excited about spending the Christmas break and the new year discovering more wonderful things, and I hope that you will join me on this beautiful journey where we're all becoming the most influential versions of ourselves. I'm wishing you all a very Merry Christmas and an incredible New Year, and the next time you hear from me, we will be in 2021. I'm pumped. See you then.